Shaquille O'Neal thought he understood what it meant to be a father until Amirah revealed the pain she had hidden behind years of saying she was fine and led him to Maya, a 16-year-old daughter who had grown up without him, forcing Shaq to confront the heartbreaking truth that love cannot recover the years a family has lost, but choosing to stay can still change every year that comes after. At 11:17 p.m., Shaquille O'Neal was still sitting in his home office when his phone lit up with Amirah's name. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioner, and almost everything around him belonged to a life people considered extraordinary: championship memorabilia, framed jerseys, family photographs, awards collected over decades. Shaq had always liked the room because it reminded him that hard problems could be solved if you stayed determined long enough. A bad season could be corrected, a business problem could be handled, a family member needed something, and he could usually find a way to provide it. So when he answered the phone and heard nothing but Amirah breathing for several seconds, his mind immediately went to the same place it always did: find the problem, then fix it. Her voice sounded controlled, but only barely. She told him she needed to come see him the next morning and that the conversation had to happen face to face. Shaq asked whether she was sick, in trouble, or dealing with someone who had hurt her, and each time Amirah told him no. What frightened him was not only what she said, but how carefully she chose every word, as though one wrong sentence could open a door she was not ready to walk through. Then she stopped him before he could ask anything else. "Dad, tomorrow I need you to do something that might be harder for you than fixing the problem. I need you to listen long enough to understand it." Shaq leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how tightly he was holding the phone. Amirah had asked him for money before, advice before, help before, but he could not remember her ever asking him simply to listen. He told her he would, though the promise felt harder than it should have. Amirah hesitated, then told him there was a girl involved, someone named Maya. Shaq had never heard the name before, but the way his daughter said it made him sit forward again. He wanted to know who Maya was and what had happened to her, but Amirah refused to explain over the phone. She told him that if she gave him only part of the story, he would immediately start making calls, finding experts, moving money, and building a plan before he understood what any of it meant. There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made the words land harder. "This time," she said quietly, "I need my dad, before I need Shaquille O'Neal." Shaq did not know how to answer that. For the rest of the call, he forced himself to ask only one question: what time should he expect her? After they hung up, he tried to return to the reports on his desk, but the words blurred together. He eventually stood and wandered into the hallway, where years of family photographs covered one wall. Tahira smiling at a graduation, Miles laughing beside his siblings, Sharif with an arm around his father, Shakir making a face at the camera, Amirah still young enough to lean into everyone around her, and Amirah, again and again, smiling in every picture. Shaq had always looked at those photographs as proof that despite the traveling, the work, the missed dinners, and the mistakes that came with raising a family under constant public attention, his children had known they were loved. That night, for the first time, he wondered whether a photograph could tell the truth and still hide something important. He stopped at one picture of Amirah standing beside him at a family event years earlier. Her smile was wide, but her body was turned slightly away from him, and he suddenly remembered how often their conversations during that period had ended with the same answer: "I'm fine, Dad." He had believed her because believing her was easier than asking what fine actually meant. Shaq thought about the way he had raised his children to keep moving, work harder, and never let pressure decide who they became. Those lessons had come from love, but sitting alone in the hallway, he began to wonder whether love could still leave the wrong message behind. He remembered times Amirah had started telling him about something difficult, and he had immediately offered a solution. Maybe she had needed the solution. Maybe sometimes she had only needed him to stay in the conversation a little longer. By 2 in the morning, he understood that the waiting was already teaching him something he did not like admitting. Being able to solve a problem was not the same as knowing the person carrying it. Shaq barely slept. Before 9 the next morning, he was downstairs with a cup of coffee he had already reheated twice when Amirah's car turned into the driveway. He stood immediately, expecting her to walk toward the house, but she stayed behind the wheel. 1 minute passed, then several more. From the front window, he could see her sitting completely still, her hands resting in her lap, and her head lowered as though she were gathering enough courage for the distance between the car and the front door. At around 7 minutes, Shaq moved toward the entrance. Every instinct in him said to walk outside, open the car door, put his arms around his daughter, and tell her that whatever she was carrying, he would take it from her. His fingers touched the doorknob, and then Amirah's words from the night before returned to him. Listen long enough to understand it. He let go of the handle and stepped back. For most of his life, Shaq had been rewarded for moving first, reacting quickly, taking control before someone else could. Now, the most useful thing he could do for his daughter was nothing at all. 10 minutes after arriving, Amirah finally opened the car door. She reached across the passenger seat and lifted out an old cardboard box with worn corners, then held it tightly against her chest as she walked toward the house. Shaq opened the door before she knocked, but he did not ask what was inside. He simply stepped aside and let her enter. They sat in the living room with the box on the table between them. Amirah looked tired, but Shaq noticed something else in her face, fear mixed with determination, as though she had spent years approaching this exact moment and was still not certain she could finish it. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Shaq could feel questions rising inside him, one after another, but he kept them there. Amirah noticed the effort and gave him a small, almost sad smile before opening the box. Inside were old envelopes, photographs, folded papers, and a small notebook that looked as though it had been handled hundreds of times. She reached beneath everything and pulled out one photograph, keeping it face down against her knee. "Before I tell you about Maya," Amirah said, "you need to understand why she trusted me." Shaq leaned forward but stayed silent. Amirah turned the photograph over. "Because once, Dad, I knew exactly what it felt like to believe nobody would understand me." Shaq looked down at the picture, and before Amirah said another word, he already knew the story was not beginning with Maya. It was beginning with his daughter. The photograph in Shaq's hands was not of Maya. It was Amirah, maybe 9 years old, standing in a lavender dress with small white flowers along the skirt. Her hair had been carefully done, and she was smiling at the camera with the stiff patience of a child who had already been told more than once not to wrinkle her clothes. Shaq recognized the dress before he fully remembered the night. He leaned back slowly, and Amirah watched the memory return to his face. For years, that moment had lived inside him as one of those mistakes fathers carry quietly and revisit when nobody else is around. He remembered the game, the schedule change, the people telling him he could not miss it, and the phone call where he tried to explain why he would not make it to her father-daughter event. What he remembered most clearly was coming home late and seeing the untouched dress hanging from her bedroom door. Amirah remembered something else. She told him she had spent the whole afternoon getting ready because she believed that if she looked perfect enough, somehow the plan would stay real. She had checked the clock every few minutes and kept asking whether there had been another call. When the answer finally came, she did not cry in front of anyone. She simply changed clothes, hung the dress back on the door, and said she was tired. The next morning, Shaq had tried to make it up to her with breakfast, a gift, and a promise that they would do something special together soon. At the time, Amirah had smiled and told him it was okay. That was one of the earliest times she remembered using those words when it was not okay at all. "You remember that night because you felt guilty," she said. Her voice was calm, which made the sentence land even harder. "I remember it because that was when I started learning not to wait for people." Shaq looked down at the photograph again. He wanted to explain that the game had mattered, that contracts and teammates and expectations had made the choice feel impossible. But even before the words reached his mouth, he knew none of that mattered now. The point was not whether he had a good reason. The point was what a 9-year-old girl had learned from it. Amirah was not accusing him of being a bad father, and somehow that made him feel worse. She was simply showing him how children can build lifelong rules from moments adults consider temporary. One missed night could become, "Don't depend too much." One disappointed expectation could become, "Don't ask twice." Enough small lessons could eventually become a person who always said she was fine because saying anything else felt dangerous. As Amirah grew older, the pressure changed shape. Being Shaquille O'Neal's daughter meant people expected confidence before they knew her, success before she had chosen what success meant, and toughness whenever life became difficult. Teachers knew her last name. Other kids knew her last name. Strangers occasionally knew things about her family before they knew anything about her. A bad grade never felt like only a bad grade, because somewhere in the back of her mind was the fear that people would think she was wasting opportunities other kids would have done anything to have. Feeling lost seemed ungrateful. Feeling afraid seemed embarrassing. Even ordinary teenage struggles could feel like evidence that she was failing at being the kind of daughter people imagined Shaquille O'Neal should have. Shaq listened without moving. He had spent his life teaching his children to keep going when something hurt, to work harder when something was difficult, and to never let pressure make decisions for them. Those were lessons he believed in because they had helped him survive his own life. He had never considered how differently they might sound to a child who already felt watched. When he said be strong, Amirah sometimes heard, "Don't let me see you fall apart." When he said push through it, she heard whatever hurts you is something you should handle yourself. When he told his children the O'Neals did not quit, she had taken it more literally than he ever intended. To Shaq, those words meant resilience. To Amirah, they slowly became rules about what she was allowed to show. She explained that nothing dramatic changed overnight. There was no single morning when she decided to stop telling him things. It happened through smaller choices that were easy to miss. When school felt overwhelming, she handled it herself. When she felt nervous in crowded places, she found reasons not to go. When she had bad days, she kept them private until the feeling passed. Shaq would call and ask how everything was going, and Amirah always gave him the answer that ended the conversation fastest. Fine. The word worked because it reassured him, protected her, and required no explanation. Shaq finally shifted forward, the weight of everything she was saying beginning to show on his face. He started to speak, but Amirah gently raised one hand. "You promised me something last night." He stopped. For a few seconds, that was the whole moment. No defense, no apology rushed out before she could finish. No explanation about how much he loved her or how different things might have been if he had understood. Shaq simply nodded and stayed quiet. It was a small choice, almost invisible from the outside, but Amirah noticed it. Her shoulders lowered slightly, as though the room had become safer by a few inches. She reached back into the cardboard box and pulled out a thin envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges. Shaq could see his name written across the front in Amirah's younger handwriting. It had never been mailed. She held it for several seconds before placing it on the table between them. He stared at his own name and felt something tighten in his chest, but Amirah did not let him pick it up yet. She told him the story had not reached that night, not yet. First, he needed to understand what happened when fine stopped being a shield and became a place she could no longer climb out of. Then Amirah looked at her father and said the one thing that made every other memory in the room disappear. "When I got older, Dad, I became so good at pretending I was okay that even I stopped knowing when I needed help." Shaq did not reach for the envelope. This time, he waited. Amirah stared at the old envelope on the table, but she did not open it yet. For a moment, her fingers rested on the edge as if the paper still carried the weight of the night it came from. Shaq said nothing. He had learned enough in the last hour to understand that every time he rushed ahead, Amirah seemed to pull farther away. So he waited while she looked past him, somewhere beyond the room, back to a place she had spent years trying not to revisit. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but quieter than before. She told him that the hardest part had not been one dramatic event. It had been the slow feeling that she was becoming someone she did not recognize. Away from home, Amirah had believed a new environment would make everything easier. Instead, the distance stripped away the routines that had once helped her hide how overwhelmed she felt. She stopped sleeping well, stopped answering messages right away, and began turning down invitations because being around people required more energy than she had. From the outside, she still looked functional. She showed up when she had to, smiled when someone took a picture, and gave the same answer whenever anyone asked how she was doing. Fine. The word had followed her from childhood into adulthood, and by then she had used it so often that even she was starting to believe it. What nobody saw was how lonely she had become inside a life that still looked completely normal. The worst night came after weeks of carrying more than she knew how to explain. She sat alone in her room long after everyone else in the building had gone quiet, staring at her phone and thinking about who she could call. Her mother's name appeared first, then her siblings, then her father. Shaq listened in the present as Amirah admitted that his name stayed on the screen longer than anyone else's. She wanted to call him, but the thought of hearing concern in his voice frightened her almost as much as the thought of hearing disappointment. She had spent so many years trying to be strong around him that she no longer knew how to suddenly say she wasn't. So she locked the phone, set it beside her, and convinced herself she would make it through the night alone. Then someone knocked. At first, Amirah ignored it. The knock came again, softer this time. When she finally opened the door, Rachel, a girl from one of her classes, was standing in the hallway with swollen eyes and her arms wrapped tightly around herself. They were not close friends. They had spoken a few times before class, exchanged notes once, and smiled at each other in passing. Rachel apologized for showing up so late and said she did not know where else to go. Amirah later told Shaq that her first thought was almost cruel in its simplicity. I can barely handle myself tonight. She could have closed the door. Instead, she stepped aside. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed and began talking. At first the words came quickly: problems at home, pressure at school, fear that she was falling behind while everyone else seemed to be moving forward. Amirah did not offer advice because she did not have any. She made tea, sat beside her, and listened. Hours passed that way. Sometimes Rachel cried. Sometimes both of them sat in silence while the building around them grew quieter. Amirah later realized that it was the first time in months she had been completely present with another person without pretending to be okay herself. Sometime before dawn, Rachel said she could not imagine how she was supposed to face another day feeling the way she did. Amirah looked at her and answered before she had time to think about it. Then don't solve tomorrow tonight. Just stay until morning. Rachel nodded, but the sentence stayed with Amirah. A little later, when Rachel started talking about everything she thought she had ruined, Amirah said it again. You don't have to fix your whole life before the sun comes up. Just stay until morning. This time, the words sounded different to her. She suddenly realized she was giving Rachel the exact kindness she had refused to give herself. By the time daylight began slipping through the blinds, Rachel was calmer. She washed her face, drank water, and agreed to reach out to someone who could help her more than Amirah could. Before leaving, she hugged Amirah and thanked her for staying awake with her. Amirah stood in the doorway after Rachel disappeared down the hall, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade. Then she looked back at her own room. Nothing in it had changed. The same phone was still on the table. The same fear was still there. But now, one thought would not leave her alone. If Rachel deserved help before things got worse, maybe she did too. That morning, Amirah finally told someone the truth. Not all of it at once, and not her family yet. She reached out to a counselor and admitted that she had been struggling far more than anyone around her knew. Saying it out loud felt humiliating at first, then strangely relieving. Nothing was instantly fixed. There was no sudden transformation, no single conversation that erased everything she had been carrying. But it was the first decision that moved her toward something other than hiding. Years later, she would understand that Rachel had not arrived to save her, and Amirah had not saved Rachel either. They had simply found each other at the exact moment both of them needed someone to stay. Back in the living room, Shaq's eyes had not left his daughter. The old envelope now made sense in a way it had not before. He understood that whatever was inside had been written during a time when Amirah believed telling him the truth was harder than carrying it alone. His hand moved toward it, almost without thinking. Amirah gently pulled it back. Not yet. Shaq looked at her, but this time he did not ask why. Amirah placed the envelope beside the box and reached deeper inside. She removed a photograph and set it between them. The girl in the picture looked to be in her mid-teens, with dark hair, tired eyes, and an expression that seemed older than the rest of her face. Shaq studied her carefully, searching for something he could not name. Amirah watched him for a moment, then rested one hand beside the photograph. There's another girl whose letter you need to read first. Shaq looked up. Amirah tapped the edge of the picture with one finger. Her name is Maya. And this time, the name no longer sounded like a stranger's. The photograph of Maya remained on the table between them, while Amirah reached back into the cardboard box. This time she pulled out a thin folder filled with printed emails, handwritten notes, and copies of messages with names blacked out. Shaq glanced at the pages and then at his daughter, trying to understand how much of her life had existed beyond what he knew. Amirah told him that after she began getting help, recovery had not arrived quickly or cleanly. Some days were better, others were not. But little by little she learned how to recognize the moments when someone needed more than advice. She also began noticing how many teenagers around her were doing exactly what she had once done, showing up, smiling, answering questions, and quietly falling apart behind closed doors. That realization stayed with her long after she felt stronger herself. At first, Amirah helped one person at a time. A friend called when she could not sleep. A younger student asked how to talk to her parents. Someone else admitted that every day at school felt heavier than the last. Amirah never pretended she could fix them, and that became part of why they trusted her. She listened, helped them find professional support when they needed it, and stayed in contact when most people would have assumed the crisis was over. Eventually, the messages stopped coming only from people she knew. Friends began sending friends, teachers passed along her contact information, and counselors quietly asked whether she could speak with students who refused to open up to adults. What had begun as a few private conversations slowly became something too important to remain informal. She called it the lighthouse. The name came from a simple idea. A lighthouse does not pull a ship to shore, and it does not steer the ship for anyone. It only stays visible when the water is dark enough that people forget where land is. Amirah rented a small office, built a basic website, and found counselors willing to volunteer a few hours each week. The rules were clear from the beginning. Teenagers could reach out without being judged, but serious situations were never handled casually, and professional help was always part of the plan when needed. The organization was small, almost invisible, but to the young people who found it at the right moment, that did not matter. Shaq stared at her. He had donated to charities, funded programs, attended fundraisers, and spoken publicly about giving back, yet his own daughter had quietly built something like this without ever asking for his help. His first reaction was pride, followed almost immediately by hurt. He asked why she had never told him. Amirah looked at the photograph of Maya before answering, as though she had expected the question for years. Because if your name had been above the door, people would have seen Shaquille O'Neal before they saw what we were trying to build. The words were not cruel, but Shaq felt them anyway. He had spent his life believing his name could open doors for his children, and now he was hearing that sometimes it could make a room harder to enter. Amirah saw the change in his face and reached across the table. She told him she had never been ashamed of him and had never wanted to erase where she came from. She loved being his daughter, but she needed to know whether something she created could stand without his money, his reputation, or people's curiosity about the O'Neal family carrying it. "I wasn't running away from you, Dad," she said. Shaq looked down at her hand over his. "Then what were you doing?" Amirah held his eyes. "Trying to find out who I was before your shadow decided it for me." Shaq did not answer. He simply squeezed her hand once, accepting that pride and pain could exist in the same moment. 3 years earlier, the lighthouse received a message just after midnight from someone who did not give a full name. The girl said she was 13 and asked one question: "Can somebody stay and talk to me until morning?" Amirah had been preparing to shut down her laptop when she read it. For a few seconds, she was no longer sitting in her apartment. She was back in that old room with Rachel standing outside her door, asking for somewhere to sit while the night felt too heavy. Amirah responded immediately and told the girl she would stay as long as they needed to keep talking. The girl eventually said her name was Maya. She did not explain everything at once. For the first hour, she mostly tested Amirah with short answers, disappearing for several minutes at a time before returning to see whether anyone was still there. Amirah stayed. Maya slowly began describing a home where promises changed constantly, a mother who was struggling with problems of her own, and a life that had taught her not to depend too much on anyone. She told Amirah that adults always said they cared at the beginning, but eventually they got tired, busy, angry, or disappeared. Amirah understood that Maya was not really asking for advice. She was asking whether this stranger would leave too. So Amirah did not make promises she could not control. She did not tell Maya everything would be fine, and she did not try to turn one conversation into a miracle. She stayed with her through the night, helped her slow the moment down, and kept bringing the conversation back to one thing: morning. By sunrise, Maya finally agreed to contact a trusted adult and accept real support beyond a screen. Before ending the conversation, she sent one last message, asking whether Amirah would answer again if she wrote the next day. Amirah told her yes. Maya did write the next day, then the day after that, and Amirah answered. Back in Shaq's living room, she pushed the photograph toward him again. He studied the girl's face more carefully this time, no longer seeing only a stranger in a picture. He now saw a 13-year-old who had once stayed awake until sunrise, waiting to find out whether one person would keep her word. Shaq asked how long Amirah had remained part of Maya's life. Amirah looked at him for several seconds. 3 years. Shaq's eyes lifted from the photograph. Amirah reached for the small notebook still inside the box. "And Dad," she said, "that's when Maya started telling me about the father she had never met." For most of her childhood, Maya Reyes learned not to trust anything that sounded permanent. Apartments changed, schools changed, and adults who promised they would be around often disappeared when life became inconvenient. Sometimes her mother, Sophia, was steady and present. Other times, she was fighting problems of her own and barely able to hold the household together. Maya adapted the only way she knew how. She stopped asking when things would get better, stopped unpacking every box when they moved, and stopped getting too attached to people who might not be there next month. By 13, she had already learned a lesson no child should have needed: expecting less hurt, less. When Maya began therapy, her counselor suggested keeping a gratitude journal. Maya hated the idea almost immediately. Writing down 3 good things every day felt dishonest when some days she could barely think of one. Instead, she bought a cheap black notebook from a drugstore and wrote a different title on the first page: People Who Stayed. She decided she would only add someone after they had proven they would still be there when things became difficult. For months, the pages stayed almost completely empty. Then, one evening after Amirah answered another message, long after the official office hours of the lighthouse had ended, Maya finally wrote the first name. Amirah. The name mattered because Amirah had never asked Maya to trust her. She simply kept showing up. When Maya disappeared for several days, Amirah did not shame her when she returned. When Maya was angry, she did not take it personally. When a good week made Maya believe she no longer needed help, Amirah did not disappear just because the emergency seemed over. Slowly, their conversations moved beyond crisis and into ordinary life. Maya talked about school, music, books she liked, and the way she hated being asked what she wanted to become when she was older, because she still was not entirely convinced her future belonged to her. Her father came up more often as the months passed. Maya knew almost nothing about him except the story Sophia had given her over the years. He had been young, involved with basketball, and gone before he knew she existed. Maya understood the explanation, but understanding did not remove the anger. Whenever things were difficult at home, she imagined a man somewhere living an easier life without knowing what she was going through. Sometimes she wanted to find him just to ask whether he had ever wondered about the people he left behind. Other times, she claimed she never wanted to know his name at all. Amirah eventually understood that both feelings were true. One night, after a long conversation about family, Maya asked the question more directly than ever before. "If you ever found out who he was, would you tell me?" Amirah stared at the message for a long time before answering. She knew that truth was not automatically the same thing as healing, especially for someone who had spent years building her identity around an absence. Finally, she wrote, "Only when knowing the truth would help you more than hiding it." Maya did not respond for several minutes. Then she sent a single word. "Okay." At the time, Amirah believed the question was hypothetical. Months later, Maya was home alone while Sophia worked an evening shift. She had been looking for an old school document when she found a cardboard box pushed behind winter clothes in her mother's closet. Inside were photographs, letters, ticket stubs, and small pieces of a life Sophia rarely talked about. Maya almost put the box back. Then she found a faded photograph of her mother, much younger, standing outside what looked like a community center. Beside Sophia was a very tall young man with one arm loosely around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera. Maya took a picture of the photograph with her phone and sent it to Amirah. The message arrived while Amirah was reviewing reports at the lighthouse. She opened the image casually at first, expecting another piece of Maya's search for answers. Then she stopped moving. The face was younger, thinner, untouched by the decades of fame that came later, but there was no possibility of mistaking the smile. Amirah had seen it in family photographs, interviews, old basketball footage, and across the dinner table her entire life. For several seconds, she simply stared at the screen, hoping her mind had connected two things that were not actually connected. Then Maya's next message appeared. "Do you know who this is?" Amirah read it twice. Her first instinct was to answer immediately. Her second was to call Maya. Instead, she set the phone down and forced herself to think. The promise she had made months earlier suddenly felt much heavier. This was no longer a girl asking about a missing father in the abstract. This was Maya asking Amirah to identify a man whose face had shaped Amirah's entire life. Back in Shaq's living room, Amirah turned the small black notebook toward him. He saw the title written in Maya's handwriting and then the first name beneath it. Amirah. Shaq looked up, but she was already reaching for the photograph beside him. "The picture Maya sent me that night," Amirah said, "was the first moment I realized her story might be connected to ours." She slid it across the table. Shaq looked down. The young man standing beside Sophia was unmistakable. It was him. Shaq kept staring at the photograph long after Amirah stopped speaking. The young man beside Sophia looked almost unfamiliar to him at first, not because he failed to recognize the face, but because he remembered the person he had been before the world knew his name. He had been younger, impatient, always moving toward the next opportunity without knowing how much his life was about to change. Sophia had belonged to that brief chapter, someone he remembered as warm, funny, and completely uninterested in the version of him basketball was beginning to create. They had known each other only for a short time, then schedules changed, travel increased, and the connection faded without a dramatic ending. Shaq had assumed she moved on just as he had. Sitting across from Amirah now, he realized one of the smallest chapters in his memory might have become the beginning of someone else's entire life. Amirah told him Sophia learned she was pregnant after they had already lost contact. She was young, scared, and unsure how to reach a man whose life was suddenly moving faster than anything around him. At first, she told herself she could handle it alone. Then, Maya was born, and handling things alone became much harder than Sophia had imagined. She worked whatever jobs she could find and depended on family when family was available, but there were months when everything felt one missed paycheck away from falling apart. Shaq listened without interrupting, though his hands had slowly closed into fists against his knees. Every detail created an image he did not want to see. A child learning to walk somewhere he had never been, celebrating birthdays he never knew existed, growing older while he remained completely unaware that he was missing anything. Then Amirah reached into the cardboard box and removed one more envelope. It was older than the others, the paper softened at the corners and marked by years of being handled. Shaq recognized his own name written across the front, but not the handwriting. Across the envelope were faded postal stamps and, in large letters, a message that made him stop breathing for a moment. Returned to sender. Amirah explained that Sophia had written the letter when Maya was still very young. She had finally gathered the courage to tell Shaq that he had a daughter and sent it to an address connected to him at the time. But somewhere between offices, forwarding addresses, and a life that had become increasingly difficult to reach, the letter came back unopened. Shaq picked up the envelope carefully, as though something inside might break if he held it too tightly. He imagined Sophia standing in a small apartment, writing words she had probably rewritten 10 times, then waiting days for an answer that never came. When the envelope returned, she had interpreted the silence through her own fear. Maybe Shaq did not want anything to do with her. Maybe someone around him had decided she was only looking for money. Maybe reaching out again would bring lawyers, reporters, and questions she was not prepared to survive. Meanwhile, Shaq had gone on living without knowing there had ever been a letter to answer. 16 years of anger, guilt, and absence had grown from a message that never reached its destination. For the first time since Amirah arrived, Shaq looked genuinely unsteady. He stood, walked toward the window, then stopped halfway there as though he had forgotten why he was moving. There were no calls he could make that would return Maya's first birthday. No check could buy back the night she lost her first tooth, her first day of school, or all the ordinary mornings when she might have wanted a father and had nobody to call. He had built his life around the belief that mistakes could be corrected through work, but this was different. He had not chosen the mistake, yet he would still have to live with its consequences. That realization hurt in a way blame might actually have made easier. Amirah let him stand there before telling him the hardest part. After Maya sent the photograph, Amirah had not gone directly to Shaq because one picture was not enough to change several lives. She quietly began checking dates, places, and pieces of Sophia's story. Eventually, Sophia agreed to cooperate because she wanted the truth settled before Maya was pulled any deeper into uncertainty. A private test was arranged, followed by additional confirmation through the proper channels. Amirah did not describe every step. She only placed the final report on the table. Shaq did not need to read every line. The conclusion was clear. Maya was his biological daughter. He sat back down slowly. For several seconds, he did not touch the report. His eyes returned instead to Maya's photograph, the one he had studied earlier, without understanding why something about her face felt familiar. Now, he saw details everywhere. The shape of her smile, the way one eyebrow sat slightly higher than the other, even something in the stubborn way she looked at the camera. He knew biology did not create a relationship, but suddenly it made every lost year feel real. Maya was no longer a girl Amirah had helped through the lighthouse. She was a daughter who had grown up with an empty space where he might have been. When Shaq finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She knows?" Amirah nodded. "For 6 months." That answer hit him almost as hard as the test. He looked at Amirah, then at the photograph again, trying to understand how Maya could have carried that knowledge for half a year without reaching for him. In his mind, the truth should have changed everything immediately. He imagined phone calls, questions, maybe anger, but at least some movement toward each other. Instead, there had been silence. 6 months in which Maya knew exactly who her father was and still chose not to enter his life. Shaq swallowed hard. "And she still hasn't come to me?" Amirah's expression changed. This was the answer she had been dreading since she walked into the house. "She doesn't want to." Shaq looked away, and for the first time all morning, Amirah saw something in her father she had almost never seen before: helplessness. He could accept that 16 years had been stolen by circumstances neither of them controlled. What he had not prepared himself for was the possibility that even after learning the truth, Maya might decide she wanted nothing from him. Amirah slid Maya's black notebook closer across the table. "Dad, finding out who you are didn't erase the father she spent 16 years being angry at." Shaq stared at the notebook titled, "People Who Stayed." His name was not inside it, not yet. Maya did not react to the truth the way Shaq had imagined. There was no sudden relief, no desperate request to meet him, no feeling that 16 missing years had finally been explained. Amirah told him that when Maya first learned who her father was, she simply stared at the confirmation for a long time and said almost nothing. She understood the facts. Shaq had never known she existed. Sophia had kept the pregnancy private, and the one letter she later sent never reached him. None of that was his choice. But Maya's anger had been built long before she understood any of those details, and facts could not simply remove a feeling that had shaped most of her life. For Maya, the hardest part was not believing Shaq had intentionally abandoned her. It was looking backward at her childhood with new information she could not forget. She remembered nights when Sophia counted bills at the kitchen table and quietly put one aside because there was not enough money for everything. She remembered wearing the same coat through 2 winters because buying another one could wait. She remembered changing schools, packing boxes, and watching her mother say they would be okay, even when Maya could see that Sophia did not believe it herself. Then, after discovering who her father was, Maya went online and found years of interviews, houses, businesses, sold-out arenas, family photographs, and a life so large it almost seemed unreal. She knew Shaq had not knowingly chosen comfort while she struggled, but the contrast still hurt. Amirah explained that Maya's anger often made no sense even to Maya herself. One day, she would defend Shaq and say it was unfair to blame a man who had never been told. The next day, she would watch an old video of him laughing with his children and shut her laptop halfway through. She could see Sharif, Amirah, Shakir, Mayara, Tahira, and Miles growing up with photographs, celebrations, advice, arguments, and memories with their father. Maya did not resent them for having those things. What hurt was realizing there had always been a version of Shaq capable of being present for his children. She had simply grown up outside the life where that version existed. Shaq listened with his eyes fixed on the floor. He wanted to tell Amirah that if Sophia had reached him, he would have helped immediately. He wanted Maya to know he would have paid every bill, attended every school event he could, and made sure she never wondered whether she mattered. But each sentence he imagined began with the same useless words: "If I had known." They were true, but they could not change a single memory Maya already carried. For perhaps the first time, Shaq understood that being innocent of abandoning her did not mean he was absent from the pain created by his absence. He had not caused the empty chair on purpose, but the chair had still been empty. Amirah then told him what Maya was actually afraid of. It was not that Shaq would reject her the moment they met. In some ways, immediate rejection would have been easier because Maya already knew how to survive people leaving. What terrified her was the opposite. She feared Shaq would welcome her, become curious about her, and make her feel safe enough to need him. Then he would discover the difficult parts, the fear, the anger, the years of instability, the way trust never came easily, and realize this new daughter was more complicated than the idea of her had been. Maya could survive a stranger walking away. She was not sure she could survive a father doing it after she had finally learned to love him. Amirah remembered the night Maya finally admitted that fear. They had been talking for nearly an hour when Maya became unusually quiet. Then she asked the question Amirah had never forgotten. What if he meets me and decides his life was better 5 minutes before I walked into it? There was no anger in the message, only the kind of fear that comes from wanting something badly enough to be afraid of touching it. Amirah had wanted to promise that Shaq would never feel that way, but she knew Maya had heard too many promises in her life, so instead, she told her that she did not have to decide anything yet. Knowing who her father was did not mean she owed him a meeting. That was the part Shaq struggled to accept. The moment Amirah finished, he stood so quickly the coffee table shifted beneath his knee. 16 years were already gone, and every instinct in him screamed that waiting any longer was another mistake. He could be on a plane within hours. He could go wherever Maya was, sit across from her, and explain everything himself. He did not need cameras or lawyers or anyone else around him. He only needed 5 minutes to look his daughter in the eyes and make sure she understood that he had not chosen to miss her life. Amirah stood too, but she did not move out of his way. She knew that look in her father's face. It was the same look he had whenever something felt urgent enough to overpower everything else. "Those 16 years were taken from you," she said. Shaq's jaw tightened, but Amirah kept her voice steady. "Don't let that pain make you take today away from her." The words stopped him. Shaq looked toward the photograph on the table. Maya did not know the man standing in that room. To her, he was still mostly a face from television, a name other people reacted to, and the biological answer to a question she had carried for years. Wanting to become her father did not mean he could walk into the role, simply because he had finally discovered it existed. If Maya had spent her entire childhood feeling that adults made choices around her without asking what she needed, then showing up uninvited would only become one more version of the same thing. Shaq slowly sat back down. Amirah returned to her chair and pulled Maya's notebook closer. The page with her own name was still open. Beneath it were several blank lines, enough space for people Maya had not yet decided to trust. Shaq stared at the empty page. For the first time since learning he had another daughter, he understood that the next move could not belong to him. But Amirah had already thought of another way. She closed the notebook, reached into the box, and placed a blank sheet of paper in front of her father. "If you really want to meet Maya," she said, "don't start by showing up." Shaq looked at the paper. "Start by letting her decide whether she wants to answer." The blank page frightened Shaq more than he expected. He had spoken in arenas packed with thousands of people, answered questions under cameras, and made decisions while millions watched. Yet one empty sheet of paper left him sitting still for nearly 20 minutes. Every opening sounded wrong. "Dear Maya" felt too formal. "My daughter" felt like a title he had not earned. Even writing his own name seemed strange, because she already knew exactly who Shaquille O'Neal was. The problem was that she did not know him. Amirah sat across from him but refused to help with the first sentence. She told him the letter would only matter if it sounded like him, not like something polished by a publicist or softened by someone trying to protect his image. Shaq crossed out 3 beginnings before finally writing one line and leaving it untouched. "Maya, I don't know whether I've earned the right to call myself your father yet, so I won't ask you to call me anything." He read it twice. For once, he did not try to sound strong. He simply tried to sound honest. After that, The words came more slowly, but more clearly. He did not write about championships, awards, money, or anything Maya could already find online. He wrote about missing shots that mattered, walking into locker rooms after disappointing people, and the loneliness that sometimes followed him even when crowds were chanting his name. He admitted there had been nights when everyone around him believed he was fearless, and he was anything but. He told her that being known by millions did not mean being understood by them. If Maya ever chose to meet him, he wanted her to meet the man before she met the legend. Shaq also resisted the urge to explain the past too much. He could have filled pages with reasons he never knew about her, but reasons would not return 16 years. Instead, he wrote that he was sorry for every birthday he had missed, even if he had not known there was a birthday to miss. He told her he understood that she might be angry at a man who had never knowingly abandoned her, because feelings did not always obey facts. Most importantly, he made no promise that he could repair everything. The only promise he offered was that if she ever opened the door, he would not treat the opportunity casually. At the bottom of the page, Shaq stopped again. Amirah watched him stare at the final empty lines, then slowly write the sentence that mattered most. "You never have to answer this letter. I'm not writing because you owe me a relationship. I'm writing because you deserve to know I would have wanted one." He signed only his first name, no title, no explanation. Then he folded the paper himself and handed it to Amirah. Maya received the letter 2 days later. She read the first paragraph standing beside her bed, then sat down before finishing the second. By the time she reached the end, she had gone back and reread several lines, searching for pressure hidden between the words. There was none. Shaq had not asked for a phone call, a meeting, forgiveness, or even a reply. That unsettled her more than a demand would have, because it left the decision entirely in her hands. She said nothing to Amirah that day. She said nothing the next morning either. Shaq asked only once whether the letter had arrived, and when Amirah told him yes, he did not ask what Maya thought. Waiting became the first thing he could give her that cost him something. 3 days later, Maya opened the small black notebook she kept beside her bed. She turned past Amirah's name and stared at the blank line beneath it. Then she wrote one word. Shaquille. She looked at the name for a long time before closing the notebook. It was not acceptance, and it was not forgiveness. But for the first time, Shaq had a place on the page instead of only a place in her anger. The question mark stayed. For now. Maya had spent years believing that finding her father would answer something inside her. Instead, knowing Shaq existed made everything more complicated. Before the letters, he had been only an absence, something she could blame, hate, or ignore whenever she needed to. Now he had a voice on paper. He admitted fear. He admitted failure. He asked for nothing from her, and somehow that made him harder to push away. If she allowed him to become real, then one day he could become important, and important people had always been the ones capable of hurting her most. For several days, Maya stopped answering Amirah's messages. She skipped one appointment, ignored calls from people she normally trusted, and left people who stayed closed on her desk. Amirah recognized the pattern immediately. Maya was not trying to disappear because she no longer cared. She was pulling away because caring had become frightening. When Amirah finally reached her, Maya admitted that she kept thinking about Shaq's letter and then getting angry at herself for wanting another one. She wanted him close enough to prove he meant what he said, but far enough away that she would never have to depend on him. Amirah knew there was no sentence capable of solving that contradiction. That evening, Amirah called Shaq. His first instinct was still to ask what he should do, where he should go, or who needed to be contacted, but Amirah stopped him before the questions could gather momentum. Maya was safe in receiving support, she explained, but she was overwhelmed by what their relationship might become. There was no problem Shaq could purchase his way out of, and no person standing in his way. The only thing Maya might need from him was a conversation, and even that had to happen on her terms. When Amirah asked whether he was willing to talk if Maya agreed, Shaq answered immediately. Then he sat beside his phone and waited. The call came later than he expected. When the screen lit up, Shaq stared at Maya's name for 2 full rings before answering, afraid that sounding too eager might frighten her away. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. He could hear faint breathing on the other end and had to fight the urge to fill the silence. Maya finally said, "You don't know me." There was more challenge than anger in her voice, as if she was waiting for him to claim that blood had already given him rights he had not earned. Shaq answered simply, "That's true, but if you let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life changing that." Maya had prepared herself for explanations. She expected him to say he already loved her, that she was family, that everything would be different now. Instead, he agreed with the one fact she trusted most. He did not know her. That honesty left her without the argument she had been building in her head. She asked what he expected from her, and Shaq told her he expected nothing she was not ready to give. If all she wanted was another letter, he would write. If she wanted silence for a while, he would respect it. If someday she wanted 5 minutes on the phone and nothing more, then 5 minutes would be enough. The conversation slowly became less about the past and more about the fear sitting between them. Maya admitted she had watched old clips of him with his other children, then hated herself for comparing their lives. Shaq did not tell her to stop. He said she had every right to wonder what 16 years might have looked like if the truth had reached him sooner. He also admitted that he had no idea how to become part of her life without making mistakes. The only thing he could promise was that he would not confuse making a mistake with having permission to disappear. Maya stayed quiet after that, and Shaq could hear her breathing change. Then came the question he was not prepared for. Maya's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "What if I'm not the daughter you would have wanted?" Shaq closed his eyes. There were dozens of comforting answers he could have given, but most of them sounded too easy. He waited until he knew exactly what he meant. "I never got to imagine the daughter I wanted," he said. Maya asked why. Shaq looked at the photograph Amirah had left with him. "Because the moment I found out about you, you already existed. There was nothing left to imagine." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Shaq wondered whether the call had disconnected. Then he heard Maya crying. He did not tell her not to cry or rush to make the moment lighter. He stayed where he was and let the silence belong to her. For years, Maya had feared that meeting him would become an audition for a place in his life. Now, for the first time, she heard him say that she did not have to become anything before he wanted to know her. When she finally spoke again, all she managed was, "I don't know what happens next." Shaq answered that he did not know either. Later, while Maya was speaking with a professional who had been helping her through the difficult transition, Shaq remained on the phone at Amirah's request. The professional asked who he was to Maya so they could understand who was involved in her support system. Shaq hesitated. Months earlier, he might have answered the question with certainty because biology had already given him a fact. Now, he understood that a fact and a relationship were not the same thing. "Her father," he said. Then he looked down at the blank page where he had once struggled to write Maya's name. "If she decides I've earned that title." Maya heard him. She did not correct him. That night, she opened People Who Stayed again. The question mark after Shaquille's name was still there. But for the first time, she touched her pen to it and wondered how much longer she would need it. The house felt different after Maya's first phone call. Nothing had been solved, yet something important had shifted, as if a door that had been locked for 16 years had finally opened a few inches. Shaq remained seated long after the call ended, staring at the phone in his hand while Amirah quietly gathered the papers from the table. He should have felt relieved. Maya had spoken to him, listened to him, and for the first time allowed the word father to exist between them without rejecting it. Instead, Shaq looked more unsettled than before. Amirah noticed him rubbing his palms together, a small nervous habit she had rarely seen growing up, and asked whether he was all right. Shaq almost gave her the answer both of them knew too well. "I'm fine." The words reached the edge of his mouth before he stopped himself. He looked at his daughter and realized how ridiculous it would be to hide behind the same answer she had spent years using because of him. So he told her the truth. There had been times during his career when he had been terrified, not nervous in the ordinary way people described before a big game, but deeply afraid of failing everyone who expected him to be unstoppable. He had walked into arenas hearing thousands of people screaming his name, while part of him wondered what would happen if, that night, he was not enough. Amirah slowly lowered herself back into the chair. The father she remembered had always seemed larger than whatever room he entered. Even when things went wrong, Shaq had turned disappointment into a joke, anger into work, pressure into another challenge he could attack. She had watched him compete through pain, criticism, expectations, and public failure without ever understanding what might be happening underneath. To her, fear had belonged to other people. Shaquille O'Neal had seemed built without it. Now he was telling her that some of the moments she remembered as proof of his strength had actually been moments when he was hiding how afraid he was. Shaq admitted that he had believed fear was something people could use against him. Basketball had taught him that opponents looked for weakness, reporters looked for cracks, and everyone expected the biggest man in the room to be the least afraid. So he learned to bury whatever did not fit the image. He played louder, laughed bigger, worked harder, and told himself that if he kept moving, nobody would notice the moments when he doubted himself. Eventually, hiding fear became so natural that he carried the habit home. When his children were scared, he tried to make them tougher instead of showing them that fear could exist beside strength. He had believed he was preparing them for the world. Amirah stared at him in disbelief. "You were scared too?" Shaq nodded. Something in her expression broke. Not anger exactly, but grief for a piece of her childhood she suddenly understood differently. She thought about every night she had been afraid to call him because she believed he would hear weakness in her voice, every time she had pushed herself through something painful because quitting, pausing, or asking for help felt like becoming less worthy of his name. If the man she had spent her life trying to resemble had simply admitted that he was afraid sometimes, maybe she would have understood herself sooner. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "Dad, if you had told me that when I was younger, maybe I wouldn't have spent years thinking fear made me less like you." Shaq lowered his head. There was nothing he could say that would make the sentence smaller. He had spent years worrying that his children might inherit his mistakes, yet he had never considered that they might also inherit the image he created to survive those mistakes. Amirah had not needed him to be less successful or less strong. She had only needed to know that strength was not the absence of fear. By hiding every vulnerable part of himself, Shaq had accidentally taught his daughter that those parts of her should be hidden too. The realization hurt because his intentions had been loving, and love had still failed to communicate what he meant. Amirah reached into the cardboard box and removed the old envelope she had stopped him from opening earlier. This time, she placed it directly in his hands. The paper had softened with age, and Shaq recognized his name written across the front in the handwriting of a much younger Amirah. He opened it carefully. The first lines described things he already knew now: how tired she had been, how alone she had felt, how often she had picked up the phone and put it down again. Then he reached a sentence about being afraid that if her father saw how badly she was struggling, he would no longer see the daughter he was proud of. Shaq stopped reading. The page trembled slightly in his hand. There was more below, but he could not make himself continue. For years, he had assumed his children knew his love was unconditional because he felt it unconditionally. He had never understood that love could be real and still be poorly translated. Amirah had not needed an invincible father standing above her. She had needed a father willing to sit beside her and say that being scared did not make her weak, being overwhelmed did not make her disappointing, and needing help did not make her less worthy of love. He placed the letter on the table and looked at Amirah. His first instinct was to apologize for missing the signs, but even that felt incomplete. He had spent too much of this conversation apologizing for what he had not known. This time, the mistake was not ignorance, it was the message he had unknowingly taught her to believe. "I'm sorry I ever made you believe that the strongest version of you was the only version I could love." Amirah looked away, pressing her lips together as if holding back years of things that had never had names. Shaq did not move toward her immediately. The old version of him would have crossed the room, wrapped his arms around her, and tried to make the pain end as quickly as possible. Now he waited. After several seconds, Amirah stood, walked around the table, and leaned into him herself. Shaq held his daughter without speaking. There was no perfect sentence left, no lesson to teach, no promise big enough to erase the years when both of them had been hiding fear from each other while believing they were protecting the other person. For once, Shaq did not try to make the moment lighter. He simply stayed there until Amirah was ready to step away. When she finally did, her eyes fell on Maya's photograph beside the old letter. 2 daughters, 2 different kinds of silence. And suddenly, Shaq understood that helping Maya would require more than convincing her he could stay. It would require becoming the kind of father who no longer needed his children to look strong before he knew how to love them. Amirah wiped her face and returned the old letter to the box. Then she picked up another envelope, one Shaq had not noticed before. The handwriting on this one was not hers. It belonged to Sophia. Shaq waited until Maya gave permission before calling Sophia. When she answered, neither of them knew how to begin. 16 years stood between 2 people who had once known each other briefly and then gone on to live separate lives. Shaq expected anger, but the moment he heard her voice, anger mixed with something heavier. He was not grieving a relationship with Sophia. He was grieving birthdays he never knew existed, first words he never heard, school mornings he never drove through, and ordinary Tuesdays when Maya might have needed a father. Those were the losses money could not rebuild. Sophia admitted that when the first letter came back, she felt humiliated and afraid. She convinced herself that trying again might only confirm her worst fear, that Shaq did not want the complication, or that Maya would become a problem to be managed instead of a child to be loved. At first, she told herself she would try again when life became calmer. Then, Maya turned 2, then 5, and every year made the explanation more difficult. "Every year I waited made the truth heavier," Sophia said. Shaq closed his eyes. "And every year you waited became another year neither of us could get back." The conversation sharpened. Shaq asked why she had not called someone, found another address, or forced the truth into his life somehow. Sophia asked whether he understood what it felt like to approach a man whose name had become an industry. She had been young, raising Maya while trying to survive, and terrified of exposing her daughter to a world she could not control. Shaq understood the fear, but understanding did not make the lost years hurt less. Sophia understood his anger, but his anger did not erase her choices. Neither of them was completely innocent, and neither could honestly turn the other into a villain. Eventually, the anger lost its energy. Sophia told him small things instead. Maya hated bananas, loved thunderstorms when she was little, and once stayed awake until midnight finishing a science project because she refused to turn in something unfinished. Shaq listened to details that should have been ordinary, and felt each one like evidence of a life that had happened without him. He did not ask Sophia to forgive his absence because he had not chosen it. He also did not offer to forgive her in one dramatic sentence. Some losses were too large for a clean ending. Maya heard only the final minutes of the call. She had come down the hallway for water and stopped when she heard her mother crying behind a half-closed door. In the past, she would have walked away. Sophia's pain had always felt too connected to everything Maya resented about her childhood. This time, she stayed. When the call ended, Sophia sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her lap, trying to regain control. Maya stepped inside and sat beside her without asking a question. Sophia apologized for allowing fear to make decisions year after year until silence became part of Maya's life. She admitted that she had always called it protection, but sometimes protection had also been an excuse to avoid what frightened her. Maya stared at the floor. She could not erase the nights she had wondered why her father never came, or the anger she felt after learning the truth. But she also saw the exhausted woman beside her, someone who had made serious mistakes while still spending 16 years trying to keep them both moving forward. "I don't know if I forgive everything yet," Maya said. Sophia nodded. "You don't have to." Maya reached over and took her hand. "But I don't want you carrying it alone anymore." Sophia began crying again, this time without turning away. Maya stayed beside her until the room became quiet. Nothing had been erased. Shaq still had 16 missing years. Sophia still had choices she wished she could undo. Maya still had questions neither parent could answer for her. But for the first time, the three of them were no longer protecting one another with silence. Later that night, Maya opened People Who Stayed. She looked at Shaquille's name and the question mark beside it. She did not erase it. Instead, on the next line, she wrote one more name. Sophia. Maya chose the restaurant herself. It was a small breakfast place, far from the places Shaq usually went, quiet enough that nobody would expect to see him there, and ordinary enough that Maya would not feel as if she were entering his world. She wanted a table near the window, no private room, no security standing nearby, and no one waiting to photograph the moment. Shaq agreed to everything. He arrived nearly 30 minutes early, wearing simple clothes and leaving everyone else behind. For once, the man who had spent his life entering rooms surrounded by attention sat alone with 2 cups of coffee and no idea whether his daughter would walk through the door. Across the street, Maya sat in Amirah's car watching him through the restaurant window. She had imagined this moment for months, but imagination had never prepared her for how ordinary he looked sitting there. There was no television screen separating them, no photograph, no letter, no phone call she could end whenever she became uncomfortable. He was real, less than 100 feet away, waiting for her. Maya reached for the door handle, stopped, then tried again. Her breathing became shallow, and suddenly, every fear she had managed through letters and phone calls returned at once. Amirah did not tell her to calm down. She did not remind Maya how far they had come, or say that Shaq deserved the meeting after waiting so long. She simply asked what Maya needed. Maya stared at the restaurant and whispered that she could not go inside. A second later, she was shaking her head, embarrassed by her own reaction, saying she had promised and that Shaq had come all this way. Amirah told her a promise to try was not a promise to force herself past what she could handle. Maya looked through the glass one last time, then turned away. Inside, Shaq saw Amirah's car across the street. He also saw the passenger door open briefly before closing again. He stood without thinking, his body moving before his mind caught up. Every instinct told him to cross the street, tell Maya she had nothing to fear, and make sure she did not leave believing he was disappointed. His phone rang before he reached the door. Amirah's voice came through with only 3 words. "Stay where you are." Shaq looked through the window and saw the car beginning to pull away. Staying felt completely wrong. He had already missed 16 years, and now his daughter was close enough to see, but still leaving without him. Yet he remembered everything Amirah had taught him since that first night in his office. Running after Maya might make him feel like a father, but fatherhood could not be measured by how quickly he satisfied his own need to reach her. Sometimes protecting someone meant allowing them to leave without making them feel guilty for it. Shaq returned to the table. He opened his phone and typed several messages before deleting them. He did not tell Maya that he was hurt, that he understood, or that she should try again soon. Finally, he wrote only what he knew he could keep. "I'm at the last table by the window. If today isn't the day, I'll still be here next week." Maya read the message in the car but did not answer. Shaq ordered breakfast anyway. The second cup of coffee remained untouched across from him. He ate slowly and stayed until the restaurant began filling with the lunch crowd. Nobody joined him. When he finally paid and walked outside, disappointment settled over him more heavily than he had expected. He had known Maya might not come in, but some part of him had still imagined her opening the door at the last possible second. He crossed the parking lot toward his car and noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. For a moment, he assumed it was something left by a stranger. Then he recognized Maya's handwriting. He unfolded the paper. "Thank you for waiting." Shaq read the 4 words again. Maya had not entered the restaurant, but she had come close enough to leave the note herself. She had returned after he stopped looking, crossed the parking lot, and placed something in his hands without having to face him yet. Shaq pressed the paper against his chest and stood beside the car for a long moment. 16 years ago, he had been absent without knowing it. Today, he had been given the chance to do something different. Not chase, not demand, not fix. Stay. And for the first time, Shaq understood that waiting might be the most fatherly thing Maya had allowed him to do. 2 weeks passed before Maya agreed to try again. She chose the same restaurant, the same Saturday morning, and the same table near the window. Shaq arrived early with only his phone and the folded note Maya had left beneath his windshield wiper. He had carried those 4 words with him for 2 weeks. "Thank you for waiting." When the door opened and Maya stepped inside, he stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. She stopped a few feet away and said, "Please don't make this dramatic." Shaq slowly sat back down. "Best news I've heard all week." Maya almost smiled, and that small movement calmed him more than anything else could have. For the first few minutes, both of them studied the menus as if breakfast required serious concentration. Shaq wanted to ask 100 questions, but he knew turning the meeting into an interview would only remind Maya how much of her life he had missed. So he let her decide where the conversation went. She did not ask about basketball, fame, or money. Instead, she looked across the table and asked, "What do you eat when nobody's watching?" Shaq laughed and gave her an answer that made her raise an eyebrow. Soon they were talking about late-night food, music they disagreed about, Maya's dislike of bananas, and the fact that Shaq had somehow become famous without learning to make a decent omelet. The ordinary conversation loosened something between them. Maya had spent months imagining what it would feel like to sit across from Shaquille O'Neal, but the man in front of her was not performing. He did not tell stories designed to impress her or keep dragging the conversation back to the 16 years they had lost. When she made fun of him, he laughed. When she went quiet, he did not rush to fill the silence. Maya began to see what Amirah had tried to explain. Beneath the name and the life everyone recognized was simply a man trying desperately not to ruin his second chance. That did not erase her anger, but it made room beside it for something new. At one point, Maya caught him staring again. It had happened when she stirred sugar into her coffee, pushed her hair behind one ear, and laughed at something he said. Finally, she put down her fork. "Why do you keep looking at me?" Shaq glanced away, wiped beneath one eye, then decided not to pretend. "I've got 16 years of looking to catch up on." Maya laughed before she could stop herself. Then the laugh disappeared, and tears came so suddenly that she covered her face with one hand. Shaq leaned forward instinctively, but stopped before reaching across the table. Every part of him wanted to take her hand and tell her not to cry, but he understood that this moment belonged to her. So he stayed where he was. Maya lowered her hand eventually and admitted she hated crying in front of people. Shaq did not tell her to be strong. He simply pushed the napkins closer and waited. A few moments later, Maya placed her hand on the table between them and turned her palm upward. Only then did Shaq put his hand in hers. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Shaq thought about everything he had missed, but he refused to turn the moment into another apology for the past. Maya did not need him grieving over every lost year while she was deciding whether he could belong in the years ahead. Instead, He asked about school. She told him about a class she hated, a teacher she liked, and a psychology assignment she had secretly enjoyed. It was not the conversation Shaq had imagined during the previous weeks. It was better because it belonged to the daughter sitting in front of him, not the daughter he had invented in his mind. Nearly 2 hours had passed when their plates were cleared. Shaq wanted to ask when he could see her again, but he stopped himself before the question became pressure. He told her he was glad she came and that she could decide what happened next. Maya picked up her jacket, hesitated, then asked, "Same place next Saturday?" Shaq nodded immediately. "Whenever you're ready, I'll—" He stopped before saying the word that had almost become natural. Maya noticed. For a long moment she studied him, and Shaq did not finish the sentence. He had called himself her father once before, but even then he had placed the title in her hands. Now she looked at the folded note beside his phone, then back at the man who had respected every boundary she gave him, even when waiting clearly hurt. "You can call yourself Dad," she said. Shaq opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes filled, and this time he did not hide it. Maya gave him a small, nervous smile, as if she was still deciding whether she had gone too far. Shaq only nodded. He did not hug her, announce the moment, or make her carry the weight of his happiness. He simply held the door open as they left the restaurant and walked beside her into the morning. At the curb, Maya reminded him, "Next Saturday." Shaq answered, "I'll be here." Maya got into Amirah's car, and for once, she did not look like someone escaping. Shaq stood on the sidewalk until the car disappeared, then unfolded the note he had carried for 2 weeks. "Thank you for waiting." He understood now that Maya had not given him forgiveness for 16 lost years, and she had not given him trust without conditions. She had given him something smaller, harder, and more valuable: permission to begin. And for the first time, the word Dad belonged to something happening in the present instead of something they had both missed in the past. The story broke on a Thursday morning before anyone in the family was ready. A reporter called one of Shaq's representatives asking about a 16-year-old girl believed to be his biological daughter. Within an hour, another outlet had the same information. By noon, Maya's name was spreading online, old photographs were being pulled from social media, and strangers were searching for Sophia. People who knew nothing about Maya were already deciding what kind of girl she was. It was exactly what she had feared. Shaq learned about the leak while driving to meet her. He pulled over and called Amirah, who confirmed that Maya had already seen the headlines. Classmates were sending screenshots and asking questions, so she had shut off her phone. Shaq's first reaction was anger. He wanted to know who had sold the story and how to stop it, but another thought came first. Maya had spent months choosing how close he could come, and now the public had taken that control away from her. For once, the most important thing was not the leak itself. It was what the leak might do to her trust. Before facing the cameras, Shaq had to tell his family. He called Shawnee first, then Tahira, Miles, Sharif, Shakir, and Mayara. There was shock, confusion, and hurt that Amirah had known first. Shaq did not defend every decision. He explained that Maya had needed privacy and that he had respected it because the story belonged to her before it belonged to anyone else. Then he made one rule clear. Whatever anyone felt about him, Sophia, or the secrecy, Maya had done nothing wrong. That rule changed the conversation. Sharif said they needed to protect her from becoming the target of everyone else's questions. Tahira agreed nobody should contact Maya unless Maya wanted it. Miles was still angry about being kept outside the truth, but he refused to make her carry that anger. Shawnee listened longer than anyone else, then told Shaq there would be difficult family conversations later. Right now, a 16-year-old girl needed to know she was not walking into a room full of people blaming her for existing. By evening, the attention had become worse. Strangers online accused Sophia of lying and Maya of wanting money or fame. Maya read only a few comments before Amirah took the phone away, but a few were enough. She had spent her whole life afraid that entering Shaq's world would turn her into a problem, and now the world seemed determined to prove her right. When Shaq finally reached her, she was quiet for so long he thought she might hang up. Then Maya offered him an escape. She said he could tell reporters the test was not certain, that more verification was needed, anything that would slow the story down. Shaq understood immediately what she was giving him. She was willing to make herself uncertain again if certainty threatened his reputation. After 16 years of wondering whether her father would want her, Maya was now offering him permission to deny her. Shaq answered without hesitation. "If protecting my reputation requires pretending you aren't my daughter, then the reputation can go." Maya did not speak. Shaq could hear her crying quietly, but he did not rush to fill the silence. This time the tears were not about whether he might leave. They came because he had been handed the easiest exit possible and refused to take it. His advisors prepared a statement that evening. It acknowledged a private family matter, requested space, and warned against speculation involving a minor. Shaq read it twice the next morning. Every sentence was careful, but none of it said the one thing Maya needed the world to hear. He folded the page, left it on the table, and walked toward the cameras without it. Questions came immediately about the test, Sophia, money, timing, and why the situation had been kept private. Shaq waited until the room quieted. He did not explain Sophia's choices or reveal details about Maya's childhood. Those parts of the story were not his to give away. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras. "There is a 16-year-old girl being discussed today like she is a scandal." The room went still. "She isn't a scandal." Shaq paused. He thought about the breakfast table, the note beneath his windshield wiper, and the first time Maya had allowed him to call himself Dad. "She is my daughter." For several seconds, nobody asked another question. Shaq continued, saying Maya deserved the same thing every child deserved, the chance to grow up without strangers deciding who she was from a headline. He asked people to leave her school, her friends, and her private life alone. He did not make himself the victim of the leak. He made it clear that the person who had lost control of her story was Maya. Across town, Maya watched with Amirah and Sophia. When Shaq said the word daughter, she lowered her eyes. She had spent 16 years imagining what it might feel like for her father to claim her, but never like this, in front of a world that had already turned her existence into a headline. Sophia reached for her hand. Maya let her hold it. A few minutes later, Shaq's phone vibrated as he walked away from the cameras. One message from Maya. "I heard you, Dad." The first family gathering after the leak was quieter than Shaq expected. Maya sat beside Amirah with her hands folded in her lap, convinced everyone was wondering how she had changed their family. Shawnee ended that fear quickly by telling Maya none of this was her fault, then turned to Shaq and made clear where her anger belonged. "Your past isn't what hurts," she said. "What hurts is discovering you decided who was strong enough to know the truth." Shaq had no defense, and for once he did not search for one. The room stayed uncomfortable, but at least Maya understood she was not the person on trial. Questions followed about why Amirah had known first and why the others learned only when the outside world was already closing in. Shaq explained that he had been trying to protect Maya's privacy, then admitted part of him had also feared what the truth might do to everyone else. Shawnee told him protection became control when one person decided what everyone else could handle. That stayed with him. Healing would not come from one apology or one dinner. It would come from allowing people to be hurt without asking them to hurry toward forgiveness. Maya spoke little until Sharif sat across from her. She admitted she had expected Shaq's children to hate her, or at least resent what her arrival had brought into their lives. Sharif shook his head and told her that people had spent years comparing him to his father, deciding what kind of athlete, son, and man he should be because of a last name he never chose. Maya's situation was different, but he understood the weight of Shaq's shadow. "People are going to decide who you're supposed to be because of his name," he told her. "Don't let them." Maya nodded, and for the first time that evening, she looked less like a guest waiting for permission to stay. Later, Shakir handed her a folded sweatshirt. Maya turned it around, expecting O'Neal across the back, but there was only one word: Maya. She looked at him, confused. "You don't need our last name to earn a place with us," he said. The sentence was almost casual, yet Maya held the sweatshirt more carefully afterward. She had spent months wondering whether belonging to this family meant becoming part of its public identity. Shakir's gift told her she could enter as herself. Tahira and Miles did not force closeness either. They asked ordinary questions, gave her room when she went quiet, and treated her like someone they could know slowly instead of a mystery that needed solving. Then Amirah moved a chair away from the crowded side of the table and looked at Maya. "Do you want to sit with us?" she asked. There was no speech about family and no demand that Maya call anyone her sibling before she was ready. Maya looked around the table, then took the seat. Shaq stayed where he was and resisted the urge to make the moment bigger than it needed to be. The family did not become whole in one evening. Shawnee was still hurt, Miles still had questions, and Maya still flinched when her phone buzzed because she feared another headline. But for one dinner, nobody asked her to explain where she belonged. They simply made room. That night, Maya sat on her bed with the sweatshirt folded beside her and opened People Who Stayed. She added Tahira, Miles, Sharif, Shakir, Amirah, and Shawnee, pausing after each name because one dinner had not proven everything, but each person had chosen not to make her pay for a story she did not create. Then her eyes moved to the oldest unfinished name on the page, Shaquille. Maya rested the eraser against the paper and thought about the letters, the breakfast table he had waited at alone, and the cameras he had faced when denying her would have been easier. Slowly, she erased the question mark. The name remained by itself, Shaquille. It was not a declaration that every fear was gone, and it was not forgiveness for 16 missing years. It meant only that she no longer saw him as a question she had to protect herself from. He had been given chances to leave, and so far, he had stayed. The lighthouse was growing faster than Amirah could afford to keep it alive. More teenagers were reaching out, more schools were asking for support, and the small team was carrying responsibilities the original program had never been built to handle. For months, Amirah had covered gaps quietly, delayed repairs, reduced programs, and moved money from one need to another. She had protected the organization the same way she had once protected herself, by making sure nobody saw how close it was to breaking. When Shaq finally learned the truth, he reacted exactly as she expected. He told her he would cover everything. Amirah said no. Shaq stared at her, confused. He was offering enough money to keep the doors open, and to him, the solution seemed obvious. But Amirah had spent years making sure the lighthouse was not dependent on one powerful person, even someone she loved. "I don't need you to rescue what I built," she told him. When Shaq asked what she did need, Amirah answered, "Help me build something that won't die when you stop writing checks." The sentence changed the conversation. Instead of solving the crisis with one enormous check, they began building a structure that could survive without either of them. The lighthouse added independent leadership, trained counselors, school partnerships, emergency support programs, long-term fundraising, and stronger privacy protections. Shaq used his connections to open doors to donors and organizations that could offer lasting support, but Amirah kept control of the mission. His name never replaced hers above the work. For once, helping did not mean taking over. Months later, the expanded center opened in a larger building with quiet counseling rooms, a small library, and enough staff that one exhausted person no longer had to carry every late-night message alone. There were no giant photographs of Shaq at the entrance, and no attempt to turn the opening into a celebration of celebrity generosity. The walls carried short notes from young people who had once needed someone to stay. Maya attended quietly with Sophia and sat near the back beside Amirah. Shaq watched his daughter greet counselors by name and understood that this place had been built from parts of her life he had never known existed. Then Amirah saw a woman standing near the far wall. For a second, she did not recognize her. Years had changed Rachel's face, but not the way she held her hands together when she was nervous. Amirah stopped walking. Rachel smiled, and suddenly the crowded room disappeared. They met halfway and hugged without saying anything at first. The last time Amirah had seen her that clearly in memory, Rachel had been standing outside a dorm room late at night, crying and asking if she could come inside. Rachel finally stepped back. "I spent years thinking you saved my life." Amirah's eyes filled. She shook her head and took Rachel's hands. "You knocked on my door on the night I needed someone too." Rachel stared at her as the meaning settled. She had always carried that night as the story of someone stronger, helping her survive a terrible moment. Amirah had carried it as proof that being needed by another person had forced her to hear the compassion she was refusing to give herself. Neither woman had been the hero of the other's story. They had simply stayed in the same room until darkness became morning. Shaq watched from a few feet away and did not interrupt. Years earlier, he might have stepped forward, added a joke, or tried to make the moment lighter. Now, he understood that some moments became meaningful because nobody tried to improve them. Maya watched too, one hand resting on the black notebook in her lap. The lighthouse had almost died because Amirah tried to carry it alone. Now, it was strong enough to keep its doors open without depending on one person to save it. And Shaq finally understood the lesson his daughters had been teaching him all along. Staying did not mean taking over. Sometimes it simply meant making sure the light was still there when someone needed to find the way home. Months after the expanded lighthouse opened, Maya asked Amirah for something nobody expected. She wanted to participate in a mental health awareness project for teenagers, not as Shaq's daughter and not as the girl whose private life had once become a headline, but in her own voice. Amirah did not answer immediately. She told Maya to think about what becoming visible might cost and what she wanted people to understand when it was over. When Shaq heard about the idea, he was the first person to object. He remembered reporters outside Maya's life, strangers judging her online, and the months it had taken for her to feel safe again. His instinct was simple. She had already been exposed once, and he was not going to let it happen again. Maya listened until he finished. Then she reminded him that nearly every important decision in her childhood had been made by adults who believed they knew what she could handle. Sophia had hidden the truth because she thought Maya needed protection. Shaq had once kept the family outside the story for the same reason. Even people who loved her had sometimes confused protecting her with choosing for her. "Everybody has spent my whole life deciding what I can handle," Maya said. She looked directly at Shaq. "If you really trust me, let this decision be mine." The words stopped him because he recognized the lesson. Love could become another form of control when fear was allowed to make every decision. So Shaq agreed, but Maya made it clear that agreeing was not the same as taking charge. She established 3 rules before anything was recorded. She would speak for herself without anyone rewriting her experience into something cleaner or more dramatic. She would decide which parts of her life remained private, including details about Sophia and the years before she met Shaq. Most importantly, the project could not end with the worst period of her life. Maya refused to become a symbol of pain frozen at the moment she was most vulnerable. "I don't want people remembering me as the girl who almost gave up," she told Amirah. "I want them to remember that I stayed." When the project was released, Maya spoke less about famous names than people expected. She talked about what it felt like to believe everyone else had life figured out, how difficult it could be to ask for help when you had spent years convincing people you were fine, and how healing often began with something much smaller than a life-changing speech. Sometimes it was one honest message. Sometimes it was a counselor answering the phone. Sometimes it was someone staying beside you until morning. She never presented herself as completely healed. She simply described what had changed once she stopped believing she had to carry everything alone. Several weeks later, an envelope arrived at the lighthouse addressed only to Maya. Inside was a handwritten letter from a teenage girl who had watched the project late one night. The girl wrote that she had been hiding how badly she was struggling because she was afraid her parents would see her differently. Hearing Maya speak had given her enough courage to walk into their bedroom the next morning and tell them she needed help. They had listened. They were now helping her find support. Maya read the letter twice before running down the hallway toward Amirah's office. By the time she reached the doorway, tears were already running down her face. She held out the page and asked the question as if she were afraid to believe the answer. "Did I help her?" Amirah read the final lines, then looked back at the girl who had once sent her a message asking whether anyone could stay until morning. "You opened the door." Maya became still. She remembered Amirah answering her first message. Amirah remembered Rachel knocking on her dorm room door years before that. None of them had fixed another person's entire life. Rachel had opened one door, Amirah had opened another, and now Maya had unknowingly opened one for a girl she might never meet. The help had moved forward because someone at each point had decided not to close the door when another person reached for it. That evening, Maya showed the letter to Shaq. She told him she had been thinking about studying psychology someday and perhaps working with teenagers who believed nobody could understand what they were carrying. Shaq felt the familiar urge to ask about schools, programs, tuition, and everything he could provide, but he caught himself before turning her future into another problem to organize. He asked only whether she was sure. Maya smiled. "Someone stayed for me." She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside "People Who Stayed." "I want to learn how to stay for somebody else." Shaq nodded and let the answer belong entirely to her. 1 year later, there were no reporters outside the house and no advisors waiting with prepared statements. There were no cameras except the one Amirah kept using to take terrible candid pictures of everyone during dinner. Shawnee was there, along with Tahira, Miles, Sharif, Amirah, Shakir, Amirah, Maya, and Shaq. The evening was loud in the ordinary way. Family dinners became loud, people talking over one another, arguing about food, laughing at stories someone had already told too many times. Maya no longer sat carefully at the edge of the table, trying to read everyone's mood before speaking. She interrupted Sharif twice, stole food from Shakir's plate, and laughed when Shaq complained that nobody respected him in his own house. Nothing about the family had become perfect, but perfection was no longer what Maya needed from them. After dinner, Maya wandered down the hallway while the others stayed behind arguing over dessert. She stopped when she reached the wall of family photographs she had seen only briefly during her first visits. There were decades there: graduations, birthdays, basketball games, Christmas mornings, school pictures, vacations, and moments so ordinary nobody in them had probably realized they were becoming memories. Maya moved slowly from frame to frame. She saw versions of her siblings she would never know: Sharif as a little boy, Amirah missing her front teeth, Shakir half asleep against his father's shoulder, Amirah small enough to disappear inside Shaq's arms. For a moment, the old feeling returned. 16 years of life existed on that wall without her. Then she noticed that the wall had changed. New photographs had been added between the old ones. There was a picture from the breakfast restaurant, taken weeks after Maya finally walked through the door, with Shaq laughing while she tried to hide from Amirah's phone. Another showed Maya sitting between Sharif and Amirah during her first family gathering. There was one of Shakir handing her the sweatshirt with Maya across it, and another of her leaning against Amirah at the lighthouse opening. Near the center was a photograph of Maya and Shaq, standing side by side after one of their Saturday breakfasts. Maya remembered hating that picture when she first saw it because she thought she looked nervous. Now she saw something else in it. Shaq was not holding her or pulling her closer. He was simply standing beside her, leaving the space between them hers to close. Shaq found her there several minutes later. He did not ask why she had gone quiet. He stood beside her and looked at the same wall. Maya touched the edge of one of the older frames. Sometimes it feels like I arrived too late. Shaq understood immediately. He had spent the past year learning that the wrong response would be to deny what she felt. Maya had arrived late for first steps, school plays, scraped knees, birthdays, and thousands of ordinary moments neither of them could recreate, so he did not tell her to forget the past. "You arrived late for some pictures," he said. Then he looked at her. "That doesn't mean you arrived late for the rest of my life." Maya lowered her eyes, then reached into the bag she had left on a chair beside the hallway. She pulled out the black notebook Shaq recognized immediately. People Who Stayed. He had seen it on the table the morning Amirah first told him Maya existed, back when his name did not appear anywhere inside it. Maya placed it in his hands without explaining. Shaq opened the cover slowly. The pages carried years of evidence. Amirah was there first. Sophia appeared later, after Maya finally understood that forgiveness and love did not have to arrive at the same speed. Tahira, Miles, Sharif, Shakir, Amirah, and Shawnee followed. Some names had notes beside them, others did not need any. Shaq turned another page and found his own name written carefully near the bottom. Shaquille O'Neal. No question mark. Beneath it, Maya had written, "He came later than everyone else." Shaq turned the page. Only one sentence waited there. But once he arrived, he stayed. He closed the notebook before Maya could see how badly his hands were shaking. It did not help. His eyes filled anyway, and the words he might once have used to cover the moment disappeared. Maya watched him struggle for a few seconds, then leaned against his shoulder. Shaq wrapped one arm around her, careful even now not to hold tighter than she allowed. The notebook remained between them. It had started as a record created by a child who believed people eventually left. Now, its final entry was not about who had arrived first. It was about who kept returning. From the dining room, Amirah shouted that everyone needed to come outside for a picture before the light disappeared. The family gathered in the backyard with the usual confusion over where everyone should stand. Shawnee tried to organize people while Miles deliberately moved after every instruction. Sharif complained about being pushed backward. Shakir insisted he had already been standing in the correct place. Amirah laughed from the middle of it all. Maya followed them outside, still holding the notebook, but when the photographer raised the camera, she instinctively stopped just beyond the group. It was an old habit. Stay near enough to watch, but far enough that leaving would be easy. Shaq saw her. A year earlier, he would have called her name, pulled her into the center, and tried to prove she belonged there. Now, he understood something better. Belonging could not be forced, even with love. So he said nothing. He simply extended one hand toward her and waited. Maya looked at him, then at the people already standing together. Amirah gave her no encouraging speech. Sharif did not wave her over. Shawnee did not rearrange everyone to create an obvious space. They simply remained where they were, leaving the decision with her. Maya looked down at Shaq's hand and thought about all the doors that had opened before this one. Rachel, knocking late at night, Amirah answering Maya's message, Shaq waiting alone at a restaurant, Sophia finally telling the truth, siblings making room at a table. None of those moments had fixed everything. They had only given someone the chance to choose what happened next. Maya took Shaq's hand. Then she stepped into the photograph herself. The group shifted naturally around her. Amirah leaned against her shoulder. Sharif moved closer on the other side. Amirah stood behind her, and Shaq remained beside her without letting go of her hand. The photographer raised the camera and asked everyone to look forward. Shaq glanced down at Maya. "You ready?" Maya looked around at the family beside her. Not a perfect family, not a family without mistakes, anger, or lost years. Just people who had learned that love meant very little without the decision to keep showing up. "This time I am." The flash filled the yard. And for the first time, Maya was no longer looking at a family memory from outside the frame. She was standing inside it,